The morning I found him, the snow was still blue. That is the only way I know to describe it. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, and the world east of my cottage was the colour of an old bruise, the kind that has stopped hurting but has not yet decided to leave. I had gone out for kindling. I had taken the small axe and the basket and the dog I did not yet have, and I had stopped at the tree line because I heard a sound that did not belong to the wood. It was not crying. A pup that small, when it is dying of cold, does not have the breath left for crying. The sound was lower. It was the sound of an animal that had given up on being heard and was only making noise because it could not stop. I followed it into the brush, and there in the snow, under the lowest branches of a black pine, I found a wolf pup. He was no bigger than my 2 hands cupped together. His fur was the colour of soot, and his eyes were closed, and there was blood on his ear that had frozen before it could finish running. He had been there long enough that the snow around him had melted into a small, dark hollow and refrozen. I was 23 years old, and I had been living alone at the edge of the Vindur Wood for 1 year and 4 months. I had been cast out of my own pack the winter before for the crime of being an omega who refused to take the mate the alpha had selected for me. I had not regretted the refusal. I had regretted, sometimes, the cold. I picked him up. I did not consider in that moment whose son he might be. I did not consider that he was a wolf and not a dog, that he might grow into something I could not keep, that his presence at the edge of my woods on a morning in late winter could not be an accident. I considered that he was small, and that he was cold, and that he was the only living thing in 3 valleys who had any need of me. And I put him inside my coat against my ribs, and I walked back to the cottage with the kindling forgotten in the snow. He did not die. That first night I thought he would. I held him beside the hearth, and I dripped warm water through his teeth with a corner of cloth. And his breathing was so shallow, I had to lean my ear to his mouth to know it was happening at all. The healer in my old pack had taught me, years ago, what to do for a fading whelp. I did all of it. I did some of it twice. Toward dawn, his eyes opened. They were the strangest colour I had ever seen on an animal. Not the yellow of a wolf, not the brown of a hound, but a slate grey with a ring of something gold at the inner edge of the iris. He looked at me. He looked at me, and he did not look away, and I understood with a kind of small, clean clarity that I had just made the most consequential decision of my life, and I had not been asked to make it. I named him Bram. I named him for the bramble where I had found him, and because the name had a kindness in it I wanted him to grow into, and because every animal worth keeping is worth naming on the first night. I carved the name into the bottom of a wooden bowl with my paring knife while he slept on my lap, and I set the bowl by the hearth, and I told him in the half-dark that he was mine now, and he was safe, and he could close his eyes and not be afraid. He closed his eyes. He grew. That is the part I do not know how to compress. 2 years is not a long time to most people. To the woman I was, alone at the edge of a frozen wood, 2 years was a country. Bram grew through the first spring, with his belly soft and pink under the soot fur, and through the first summer, with his legs gone clumsy from new length, and through the second winter, with his shoulders broadening past the size of any dog I had ever known. By the second spring, he stood as tall as my hip. By the autumn after that, he stood at my shoulder when he rose on his hind legs, which he did sometimes when he wanted to look at me head on. And his eyes had not changed colour since the night I had pulled him from the snow. I knew by then what he was. I had known in honesty by the end of the first month. Wolves do not bond to humans the way Bram bonded to me. Wolves do not learn 36 words by the end of their first year. Wolves do not bow their head under a woman's hand the way Bram bowed his, with the kind of deliberate gentleness that was a choice and not a habit. He was a shifter pup. He had been born a wolf and would shift, when his time came, to a boy. I had been told growing up in the pack that this happened around 5 years of age in the bloodlines that carried it, and Bram was nowhere near 5. I had time. That was what I told myself for 2 years. I did not have time. The knock came on a morning in early winter, the second winter of him, and the snow that morning was the same blue it had been on the morning I found him. I should have known something by that. I should have known that the world does not return to that colour twice without a reason. I was at the hearth, braiding a length of cord. Bram was on the rug at my feet, with his head on his paws, and his ears were already up before the knock came, and his ears were a kind of warning I had learned to read. I went to the door. I did not look out the window first. I do not know why I did not. I had spent 2 years living at the edge of a wood that was reputed to be the southernmost border of the Iron Territories, and I had spent 2 years not opening the door to anyone who knocked. Because no one knocked at my door but trouble. But that morning, with Bram's ears up and his eyes fixed on the door, I went to it without looking, and I opened it. There was a man on my step. He was tall. He was tall in the way men in the old stories are tall. Not in measurement, but in occupation, as if the air had thickened around him to make room. His cloak was dark grey, lined with something black at the throat, and there was a sword at his hip that had clearly been used and recently cleaned. His hair was the colour of wet iron, and his eyes were a slate grey, with a ring of something gold at the inner edge of the iris. And behind him, on the snow path that led to my cottage, were 6 men on horseback who had not yet dismounted. He did not speak. He was looking past me. He was looking past me at the rug by the hearth, where Bram had risen to his full height and was standing very still, with his head lifted and his nose working the air. And what happened next, I will be telling people about for the rest of my life. And I do not know whether I will ever find the right words for it. Bram made a sound. It was not a bark. It was not a growl. It was the small high sound a pup makes when it has been lost and found. The sound he had made on the first night in my arms, when he had finally believed he was warm. And it came out of the chest of an animal who stood at my shoulder and was no longer small at all. He moved. He moved past me, not knocking me down, going around me, the way he had learned to go around me with a deliberateness that had always seemed to me too careful for an animal. And he went down the 2 stone steps of my cottage into the snow, and he stopped 1 pace in front of the man in the grey cloak, and he lifted his head, and he met the man's eyes, and he did not look away. The man went to his knees. He went to his knees in the snow of my dooryard, this stranger, this man who had not yet spoken a word in my presence, and he put one hand to the side of Bram's face, the way a father puts his hand to the face of a child who has been very far away for very long. And he closed his eyes, and his shoulders shook once, and that was all. I did not move. The 6 men on horseback behind him did not move. The wood behind them did not move. He stayed there for a long time, long enough that I began to be afraid, the way one is afraid in the middle of a kind of grief one is witnessing, without permission. Then he opened his eyes, and he lifted his hand from Bram's face, and he looked up at me, and he said, in a voice that did not match the kneeling, "My lady, forgive me. May I come inside?" It was not a question. It was the request a king makes when he has decided to be a guest. I said, "Yes." He stood. He came up the 2 stone steps, and he ducked through my low doorway, and Bram came with him, walking at his side as easily as he had walked at mine for 2 years, and the men on horseback dismounted but did not approach. The man in the grey cloak stopped 1 pace inside my door, and he looked at my hearth, and at my carved bowl on the floor by the hearth, and at the rug where Bram slept, and at me, and he said, "I am Torvald of the Iron Territories." I knew the name. Everyone in the 3 valleys knew the name. Torvald of the Iron Territories was the Alpha King to the north, the man who had ruled for 15 years and was reputed to have lost his only son and his mate in the same winter 2 years ago, and who have ridden the western reaches of his own kingdom personally every season since, looking for something he refused to name. I had heard the stories. I had not made the connection. I had not made the connection because I had not let myself make it. I said, "I am Neve of the Vindur Edge." He looked at me a long moment. "I know who you are," he said. "I have known where you were for 1 year and 10 months. I was waiting until I was certain." Certain of what? Of him. He looked down at Bram, who was leaning his head against the king's thigh, in a way that no animal who had not known a man for years could lean. He was taken from his cradle on the night of the worst storm of the winter 2 years ago, the king said. His mother, my mate, had been dead 2 days. The pup was 3 months old. He was carried out of the fortress in a basket by someone who had been trusted in our household. The man who carried him out was found 3 days later in a ravine, frozen, and the basket was not with him. We searched. We searched for 1 year. I have been searching personally for the year since. I have ridden the southern wood twice. I am told a woman at the edge of the Vindur takes meal and salt at the market in the village every full moon, and has raised what the villagers say is the strangest dog they have ever seen. He is not a dog. He looked back up at me. "He is my son," he said, "and you have kept him alive." If you have stayed with me this far, stay a little longer. I do not know any way to tell what came next that does not require you to be in the room. Let me try anyway. If her voice is the kind you want with you tonight, the moon icon below will keep her stories coming. There is more. I sat down. I sat down because I did not have a choice. I sat down on the wooden bench beside my own table in my own cottage, with the wood smoke smell of 2 years of my own life around me. And the man who had identified himself as the Alpha King of the Iron Territories stood in the middle of my one room with his cloak still on, and the pup I had pulled from the snow at 3 months old stood between us, with his head tilted slightly toward me. And I understood for the first time what I had done. I said, "I did not know."
"I know you did not know."
"If I had known—"
"You would have done what you did."
He said it with the certainty of a man who had been thinking about this conversation for some weeks. I do not know how long he had been standing on the edge of the road outside my cottage before he had walked up to the door. I do not know how many mornings. "My king," I said. "Torvald. I cannot—" "You can." I looked at Bram. I looked at Bram, who was, I now understood, not Bram. I looked at Bram, who was the son of the king in my doorway. I looked at his slate-grey eyes that I had now seen for 2 years, and that I had now seen for the first time in his father's face. I looked at the bowl I had carved his name into on the night I had been certain he would die. I looked at the rug. I looked at the cord I had been braiding for him, a hat I would not now finish. I felt something open in me that I did not have a name for, and would not have one for some time. The king saw my face.
"I will not take him from you,"
he said. I lifted my eyes. "I mean that. Hear it. I will not take him from you. I have come to bring him home, and home, for the rest of his life, will be wherever you are. You raised him. The pack will know that. The pack will know it from my mouth before the next full moon. I am not here to thank you and ride away. I am here because he is mine, and because the moment he saw you turn for the door behind you, he stood up and called for you in the voice of a frightened pup, and because I am not going to be the man who undoes 2 years of love by taking a child away from the woman who saved him. I am not that man. If I ever was, I am not now." He stopped. He stopped because he had run out of breath, and I think because he had run out of the words he had rehearsed. I said, "There is tea on the hearth." He said, "Yes, please." We did not say anything else for the better part of an hour. The king of the Iron Territories sat at my small wooden table in my one-room cottage, with his cloak still on his shoulders, and I poured him the rough black tea I bought once a season at the village market, and his men outside stayed at the road, and Bram lay down at his father's feet, with his head on his father's boot. And the king let one hand rest on Bram's head, and did not speak. I think he could not. I think if he had spoken in that first hour, he would not have been able to stop. And he was a man who had spent 2 years learning not to start. I let him have the silence. I drank my own tea and watched the snow turn from blue to white outside the small window. And I thought about the bowl by the hearth, and about the wooden cord on the bench beside me, and about the life I had built and was about to learn was something other than I had thought. After the hour, he said, "Tell me about him." I told him. I told him about the first night, and the cloth, and the dropped water through his teeth. I told him about the eyes opening. I told him about the day Bram had killed his first rabbit, and brought it to me with such ceremony I had laughed until I cried. I told him about the words, the way Bram understood "stay" and "come" and "no," and eventually I am tired, and it is cold, and the man from the village will be at the door at sundown. I told him about the night Bram had set himself in front of me when a forest cat had come too close to the cottage, and how he had not moved until the cat had decided we were not worth it. I told him about the bowl. I told him about everything. He listened. He did not interrupt. His face moved, sometimes, in ways I do not think he intended me to see. Once he closed his eyes and kept them closed for a long breath. Once he reached down and ran his thumb along the silver streak that had been on Bram's left ear since the night I had found him, where the blood had frozen. And Bram lifted his head into the touch, the way a child leans into a remembered hand. When I had finished, he said, "His name was Vidar." I felt something fall a long way inside me and land softly. "It is his name," he said. "It will always be his name. But, Neve," he looked at me. He looked at me for the first time, the way one person looks at another, and not the way a man looks at the woman who has been keeping his son alive. "He is Bram too. He was Bram first, for him. He chose to come when you called him Bram for 2 years. The pack will hear his name as Vidar. He will hear his name from you as it always has been. I would never take that from him, or from you." I did not cry. I would like to claim this because I think it is the strongest thing I did that day. I did not cry. I had cried plenty in the 1.5 years before Bram came, and a little in the 2 years after, and I had decided, somewhere along the way, that I would not cry in front of strangers any more. The king of the Iron Territories sat in my cottage, and I did not cry. I picked up my cup of cooling tea, and I held it in both hands, and I said, "There are scouts of yours in my outer paddock who have been there for at least the last 20 minutes. He went very still. "I do not know how I know," I said. "I think I have been watching them through the small window without realizing. They are not your men from the road." He stood. He stood without speaking. He moved to the small window and he looked once, and his face did the thing his face had been trying not to do since he had come inside, and he did not move from the window. "Neve." "My king?" "Get behind the table." I got behind the table. He went to the door. He went to the door, and he opened it, and he said one word in a voice that did not carry past the threshold, and his 6 men were off their horses and moving across my dooryard in formation before he had stepped down the 2nd stair. Bram was up. Bram was up and at his father's side, and his ears were flat to his skull, and the sound coming from him was not the small sound of the morning, but the low sound of an animal who has decided. The man who came out of the paddock with the knife was wearing the colours of the king's own court. I did not know that yet. I learned that later. What I saw from the window behind the table was a man in dark wool who came at the king from his right side with a thin blade held low and a swing that had been practised. And I saw the king step into the swing rather than away from it. And I saw Bram move. Bram took the man at the wrist. He took the wrist of the hand that held the knife, and he did not let go. And the knife went into the snow, and 2 of the king's men were on the attacker in the next breath, and the 3rd one in the paddock had already been brought down by the other 4, and a 4th had come around from behind the goat shed with his hands raised, crying out a name I did not yet recognize, and was not now ever going to forget. Scarn. It was over inside a minute. The king turned slowly. He turned toward me and Bram, in that order, and he came back up the 2 stone steps, and he put one hand on Bram's head, and he looked at me through the doorway behind me, and he said, in a voice that had nothing in it but the iron the territories had been named for, "Are you hurt?" I shook my head. And as I shook it, I realized my hand was wet, and I looked down, and I saw that I had a thin slice along the outside of my forearm from where I had moved between the window and the table at some point I did not remember, and that I had cut myself on the corner of the table when I had moved, and that it had not been the attacker who had done it, but the table, and that the king had seen it before I had. He did not let go of Bram's head. He came inside, and he closed the door behind him with the side of his boot, and he said, "Sit down. Where is the cloth?" I sat down. I told him where the cloth was. He bound the cut with the cleanness of a man who had bound many cuts. He did not look at my face while he did it. He looked at the work of his hands, the way he had looked at the work of his hands the entire time he had spoken with me about his son. And I understood for the first time that this was a man who had learned to keep his face turned away from the things he could not afford to want. When he had finished, he sat down across from me at the small table. He said, "Scarn was on my council. He has been on my council for 9 years. He carried my son out of the fortress in a basket on the night my mate's body was cold. He told me, when he returned, that he had found the pup dead in the snow at the edge of the wood. I did not know. I should have known. I will spend the next 20 years of my life understanding how I did not know." He stopped. He came for him today because he had heard the pup was alive. The man who came at me was not the only one. There will be 3 or 4 others who will be found by my men in the next hour in the wood between here and the road. They are not here to take the pup. They are here to kill him, and you, and to bury what you have done so that no one in my court can use the truth against him. He thought he could be ahead of me by half an hour. He was ahead of me by 12 minutes. I said, "What happens to him?" "He will stand trial. He will be found guilty. He will be executed by the pack he tried to disinherit. I will not be the one to swing the blade. I do not trust myself with the blade." He looked at his hands on the table. "I would like to," he said. I put my unhurt hand over his. I do not know why. I had not touched a man in 3 years. I had not touched a man kindly in 5. I put my unhurt hand over his, where it had closed on the wood of my table, and he did not move. And I said, "Then it is right that you will not." He turned his hand slowly under mine. He turned his hand the way one turns a thing one wishes to be sure of, and his palm met my palm, and he held my hand in his on the surface of the small wooden table in the cottage that had been mine alone for 1 year and 10 months, until a knock at the door had changed it. And he did not say anything else, and I did not need him to. The trial was held at the next full moon. It was held in the great hall of the Iron Fortress, and I attended at the king's invitation, and I sat in a chair to the side of the dais, with Bram at my feet, and a wrapped wound on my arm that no one in the room knew the origin of. And I watched as Skarn of the Eastern Branch, Beta of the King's Council, was found guilty by the pack of the abduction and attempted murder of the king's heir, of treason against the throne, and of the attempted murder of the woman who had raised the heir. He was stripped of rank in front of the pack. The blade was swung by the new Beta, a man named Osric Stonewright, who had been brought up out of the warriors that morning, and had not yet stopped looking faintly surprised about it. Skarn did not beg, I will give him that. When it was done, the king stood. He did not address the pack about the trial. He addressed them about something else. He said, in the same voice that had carried across my dooryard, "There is a woman in this hall who has raised my son for 2 years at the edge of the Vindur Wood. She did not know whose he was. She kept him warm. She kept him fed. She kept him safe. She named him in a wooden bowl and taught him 36 words and stood between him and a forest cat in the dark. The pack of the Iron Territories owes her a debt that cannot be measured in land or in titles or in coin, and I will not be the one to insult her by trying." He turned to me. "Neve of the Vindur Edge," he said, "I am asking you to come home with me, not as a debt to be repaid, not as a position to be granted. As a question, I am asking you because you are the only one I will ask. Will you come with me? Will you bring our son? Will you let me—" He stopped. "Let me try to deserve what you already are." I stood up. Because if I had stayed sitting, I do not think the rest of my life would have come out of my mouth in the right shape. I stood up, and Bram stood up with me, and I walked across the hall in the dress the healer had lent me for the trial, and I stopped 1 pace from the king of the Iron Territories. I said, "Yes." He did the thing his face had been trying not to do. He bent his head. He bent his head to mine, in front of his pack, and he kissed me. Once, briefly, on the place where my brow met my hair, the way one kisses a thing one is finally permitted to claim, and the heat of it went all the way down into the place in my chest where I had been holding a question for 2 years without knowing I was holding it. And when he straightened, I understood that I had a home now, and a son, and a man, and that none of the 3 had been given to me as a gift. They had been recognized. The pack roared. I will not pretend to remember the rest of that night clearly. The claiming ceremony was held 3 months later, at the spring moon, after the new Beta had been confirmed, and the council had been rebuilt, and the king had finished personally riding the western reaches 1 final time, to be sure none of Skarn's allies remained at any garrison. I wore green at the ceremony, because Vidar, who answered to both his names, and who had begun to shift, in small bursts of moments, when no one was looking, and would be a boy of perhaps 7 within the year by every healer's reckoning, had asked me to wear green. He had said it was the colour of the moss by the cottage. He had said it was the colour of home. We did not sell the cottage. That was the king's idea, and I will love him for the rest of my life for it. The cottage stands at the edge of the Vindur Wood, with a steward in it who keeps the hearth lit and the windows patched. And 3 or 4 times a year we ride down, the king and I and Vindur, who walks on 2 legs more often than 4 now, and who is taller every visit. And we stay for a week. The wooden bowl stayed there. I would not let it be moved. Vindur, when he is on 4 legs in the cottage, still eats from it. The bowl is older than he is, in his memory. He thinks I made it for him. I did make it for him. The fact that I did not know whose son he was when I carved his name into the bottom of it does not change that I was carving for the boy I was about to spend my life loving. Tell me, did you see it coming when she walked to the door without looking out the window? Or did you, like me, think she would find another solitary morning at the edge of her wood? Stay a moment longer. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and whether you have ever found something in the snow that was not what you thought it was. Subscribe, the moon icon below, and her voice will find you again next week. The Vindur Wood is full of mornings I have not yet told you about.